Thank you very much. Thank you for your time here today. I am Jenny Jorgensen. I'm with the National Laboratory of the Rockies. If the name of that institution doesn't sound familiar to you, we were previously known as NRL. I've been with the lab for over a decade. I've been using PLEXOS for most of that time. And today I'm going to be talking about a study focused on transmission value in the Southeast US. Funded by the US Department of Energy and conducted in partnership with the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. As part of, the goal of this project was to provide insight to the Department of Energy's congressionally mandated 2026 Transmission Needs Study to be published later this year. And then I'd also like to acknowledge my project team shown on this slide, again encompassing a few different national labs as well. Okay, so first slide. The goal of this project, as the name sort of implies, is to provide insight into the role of transmission, interregional transmission, especially in the southeastern United States. So the map on this first slide, let me see if I can. Nope, okay, let's try this. There we go. The map on this first slide shows the valuation from previous examinations looking at the value of interregional transmission using empirical data. So this uses actual market data, the difference in locational marginal prices between adjacent regions to imply the marginal value of new transmission between those regions. But as you can see, the Southeast US is a bit of a data desert. There is the Southeast energy market there, but it's relatively new. It has very small market depth at the moment. So the goal was to see if we could use, instead of empirical data, if we could use model data from PLEXOS to sort of fill this gap here. Secondarily, we wanted to make sure, the second part of this question was slightly more academic, but still sort of important. If we did decide to use, model data where empirical data doesn't exist, how do our underlying model assumptions impact the overall transmission value metric shown here on the slide? So again, we're never going to capture everything in our PLEXOS data set, but we can attempt to, sort of layer real-world dynamics that imprice the variations in locational marginal prices that we see every day. Okay, so this next slide sort of sets up our methodology. Also shows a picture of an onion, which I promise is relevant. But as you know, grid modeling tools such as PLEXOS can really help provide insight into the role of things such as incremental transmission in various places and interregional transmission especially. So we think of many barriers to large-scale transmission integration, usually categorized into the 3 Ps, paying, permitting, and planning. So we're trying to attempt to provide some insight into the planning portion of that using PLEXOS. So again, we start with a simplified grid model and then attempt to layer some of those real-world dynamics on top of it to see how that impacts our overall value of transmission as determined, in this case, in the modeling world. So back to the onion. We think of layering the complexity, the real-world complexity, onto a relatively simple model as layering detail as the layers of the onion. So the more layers of detail that we can represent, hopefully, the more detailed picture we can sort of capture with PLEXOS. Okay, so setting aside the onion, our focus for this study is the southeastern US, as I mentioned. So that's the region bounded by the yellow and orange on this slide. We start with a zonal level transmission model for the entire Eastern Interconnection, captured by, I think, a few hundred nodes, but a node is basically sort of bordered by these light gray or dark gray boundaries on this map, connected to adjacent nodes with transmission lines. The initial transmission and generation topology is populated by NLR's long-term capacity expansion model called REEDS. Obviously, REEDS usually is a forward-looking tool, so it would look decades into the future. In this case, we're not using it to expand anything. We're just using it to populate our initial data set for recent historical years. Using internal workflows. Okay, so obviously since capacity expansion models typically consider decades into the future, they often have to make simplifications on the operational side. So things like heat rates, min up and down times, those kinds of things are often simplified. And so we saw that as sort of an opportunity to add that realism on top of it. Okay, so then we take that model from Reeds and we populate our PLEXOS ST model. Before we added realism, we first did benchmarking against historical generation. So this is comparing our installed capacity that we got from Reeds to actual historical data in terms of both installed capacity and generation. This took a little bit of iteration, but in the end we were pretty happy with sort of a representation of the Southeast. We were able to describe sort of discrepancies in this based on the difference in footprint that we were considering. Our Reeds model capturing a slightly larger footprint than what we were considering in EIA. We obviously don't have information about all the other reasons why generators run that may not be economical, such as must-run statuses and that kind of thing. So this is sort of where we started. We also did some benchmarking against historical flows, transmission flows, and we did that with a variety of hurdle rates represented by the wheeling rate in PLEXOS, and found that $10 per megawatt hurdle rate sort of best approximated that historical flows that we saw within the South, or not even within, not even within the Southeast, but across the whole Eastern Interconnection. All right, next slide. Okay, so back to the onion. How did this initially simple model, and then we added variation on top of it? I'm going to talk about sort of each of these levels of detail, or in more detail on the following slides. But basically, this just shows sort of the additive way that we added detail on top of each other. So each step sort of gets slightly more detailed, and then by the end, we have all levels of available detail on top. Okay, so first level of detail is heat rate variation. So like I mentioned, Reeds does a simplified binning. They do sort of k-means clustering to compute heat rates for each generator type within sort of large aggregated regions. And then plants are simply assigned sort of an aggregate heat rate level. It's kind of hard to tell from this histogram, which shows the histogram of heat rates that we started with on the top here. But there was actually close to 400 gas CC plants in the eastern US that had identical heat rates. So we replaced those with unit-specific heat rates from Hitachi velocity suite data. You can see on the bottom, some of our categories kind of get more spread as we reflect sort of more of that real-world variation, even though our fleet-wide average heat rate, which is shown by the horizontal red line, or sorry, vertical red lines here, doesn't change much between the two. But obviously, in the case of the gas CCs, we are having much more variation, which could in turn drive variation in the locational marginal prices. Okay, so the next layer was the natural gas fuel prices. Our baseline natural gas fuel prices were actually taken from EIA, Annual Energy Outlook. You might immediately say that's ridiculous because the EIA is supposed to be forward-looking. We're looking at recent past. We used, again, sort of average natural gas prices, hourly average gas prices averaged on a daily basis, again from the Hitachi velocity suite data. So you can see how obviously our natural gas price is varying widely across the past decade or so. There are a lot of factors, as we know, competing uses in the winter, geopolitical forces, but in particular, because this comes up later in the results, I will highlight that in 2022, sort of consistently higher gas prices that then sort of stabilized again in 2023. So now we, in addition to sort of our original, not very good, not very granular natural gas prices, we have added another layer of detail on top. Okay. The next level of detail was adding day-ahead load forecasts. So the base case assumes perfect load forecasts, but for added detail, we sort of mined EA 930 data to compute hourly day-ahead load forecasts by balancing authority by hour. Where data was missing, we assumed perfect forecasts. These two histograms show the hourly load forecast error in the Southeast. So you can see, sort of on average, the day-ahead underestimates the real-time load on the order of a couple thousand megawatts, or around, a little over 1%. And the way that we implemented this was basically by running the PLEXOS ST twice. So in the first time, we used the day-ahead load forecast, and we determined the commitment or on-off status of our sort of large slow-start generators like gas and CCs and coal. And then we ran again with the updated real-time realized load forecast. And then, of course, we had a limited resources then in the economic dispatch to respond to any variation imposed by those errors in load forecast. Okay, so next we included temperature-correlated generator outages. So in our base case, we just use a singular forced outage rate applied consistently across each generation fleet. I guess it's kind of hard to see on here, but we use basically one random draw from the PLEXOS PASA module, which is shown in the dark purple here, but you can see it's just constant across the whole year. There's obviously some random variation, but in our more detailed data set, we layered on the correlation of generator outages with temperature data. So we're actually still doing sort of a singular deterministic draw, but we are using an in-house resource adequacy tool along with historical temperatures and assumed generator outage function based on temperature. So basically that data shows that at extreme highs and extreme lows, we see higher generator outage rates, which are then sort of applied in this tool. So in this way, we can see, during the summer, during higher temperatures, we do see increased outages. We can also pick out some cold spikes here in our data. Even though, sort of on the whole, our outage rate doesn't change all that much, we do see like sort of the impact of kind of extreme weather events and how that could impact your existing generator fleet. There's a slight, I should point out, sort of a limitation with this. At the time, this was used by mining historic GADS data just for the PJM region, and obviously we've applied it to all of the Eastern Interconnection. We know that, weatherization protocol and other things vary widely across the East, so it's definitely an area for future improvement, but at least it would capture, sort of that correlation with those temperature extremes. Okay, and I guess lastly, we added in weather year variation. So we didn't change the underlying transmission or generation fleet at all, but we did include other, sort of variables that do tend to change with the weather. That includes load, solar and wind profiles. So we added those on top of the varying natural gas prices, the historical outages that I mentioned for the final layer of the onion. Okay, so the outcome. So again, this metric was actually spoiled by Mark's presentation just before me, but as you can see, the metric which was focused on the average locational marginal price difference between adjacent regions to imply the value of transmission between those regions. You can see how, as we add complexity in our model, so starting from the least detailed or the base case all the way through to the sort of most detailed case in the darkest blue, an increase in the transmission value as we account for those things that we know are impacting locational marginal prices on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis. As you can also see, there's a very wide variation in these values, not only just within a particular year, but also across years. So 2022, like I mentioned, we also had some crazy natural gas prices, thus indicating sort of a higher implied value for transmission between exchange between regions. 2023, when natural gas prices had stabilized, you can see the transmission value goes down a little bit. We suspect that the Southeast is not super transmission constrained, so perhaps that's consistent with a lot of the values that I showed on the earlier slide in regions that don't necessarily have that. Okay, so this last slide just compares the base case, now shown in black, to all this full sweep of weather years, so between 2016 all the way through 2023, with all of those layers of detail accounted for. Generally, the same sort of finding here holds. Of course, when you compare that base case that has a lower value of transmission, but as you start accounting for all of those variables, it goes up a little bit. Okay, so to fully summarize, basically the goal, the primary goal of this study was to help influence the Department of Energy in writing their 2026 Transmission Needs Study. So really that dollar per megawatt hour metric was the useful outcome of this study. And basically we found that in various places within the Southeast, the transmission value sort of ranged between $5 per megawatt hour on the low end, up through $15 per megawatt hour on the high end. But of course, a lot of variation between there within years and across years. And similar values between the Southeast, or between Florida and CERTIP. But basically, we did find that as we added more modeling detail, we were able to sort of extract more value from that transmission, accounting for the price dynamics that would impact price fluctuations on a daily level. So again, we were able to sort of drive differences in value by adding, accounting for differences in the generator fleet, fuel price variability, temperature correlated outages, and all the other sort of impacts that weather has on load, solar, and wind as well. That's all. Thank you.